Hi, welcome to Science Friday Educate. This is Science Friday's online Google Hangout to discuss challenges of teaching evolution in the classroom. This is a live Google Hangout. We've got a panel of experienced guests here to talk with you. Throughout the discussion, you can tweet your questions with the hashtag #TeachTheE, which is to say teach the evolution in your classroom. So please join us. We'll be tweeting and responding to your questions throughout the discussion. With me today, I have a panel of teachers from across the country. Joining me today is John Doty. He's in his 4th year teaching biology at LaPorte High School in LaPorte, Indiana. Say hi.
Thank you for having me. Hi.
Oh, we're happy to have you. Darren Massa is a middle school science teacher and technology coordinator at Chico Country Day School in Chico, California. Darren has been teaching for over 15 years, was a Los Angeles County Teacher of the Year nominee, and is a Google certified teacher. Welcome, Darren.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, we're happy to have you as well. We're hoping to be joined soon by Allison Miller, who's a teacher of 12 years and currently teaches multiple science subjects at Nashua High School in North and Nashua, New Hampshire. Excuse me. Allison is a former researcher and is a recent recipient of the National Center for Science Education's Teacher Scholarship. My name is Ariel Zich. I'm Science Friday's Education Manager. I am responsible for building partnerships and supporting teachers with free education resources and also helping to coordinate events like this today. Our moderator for this discussion is Dr. Amanda Glaze. Dr. Glaze holds a PhD in Curriculum and Instruction Science Education and is a second major in Biological Sciences from the University of Alabama. She is presently a science specialist teaching middle school grade sciences at Jacksonville Middle School Preparatory Academy and is a member of graduate faculty at Texas A&M University Commerce. Her research centers on the intersections of science and society, specifically the acceptance and rejection of evolution in southeastern United States and the broader impact of conflict between religion and evolution on science literacy in the general public. You can see Dr. Glaze in a recent Science Friday macroscope video called The Pot Stirrer, in which she kind of describes the situation in her county and also talks a little bit about her strategy. We're very excited to have you with us today, Dr. Glaze.
Thank you. Very excited and happy to be here.
And if you'd like to give us a little introduction, Amanda, before we get started, kind of help contextualize this discussion. We're already receiving tons of questions between Twitter and our Hangout app, so fire away and give us a feeling for the landscape for evolution education.
Absolutely. Evolution is widely regarded as the unifying collection of theories in science. But there's still a great conflict among the general public when it comes to accepting and sometimes even discussing evolution. This is a really common issue around the United States, and nowhere is this more apparent than in middle school and high school classrooms around our country. Common patterns are clear. People draw lines between macro and microevolution. Something we commonly hear is people dismissing evolution as just a theory. They're not sure that it's been tested, or they still think that a theory is something that has to be elevated to a law before it becomes something real. We're commonly asked, why are there still monkeys? Or perhaps it's something that our students refuse to even talk about, or refuse to allow it to be discussed, or even teachers refuse to allow it to be discussed in their classrooms. We know as lovers of science that the power of science comes from the fact that it's self-correcting, that nothing in science is ever 100% proven, because we're always going to retest and continue to search for new lenses to look at our data and understandings. We know that a theory in science is not a guess, but scientific fact. The theories are collections of experiments and data, interpretations that explain how and why things in nature are occurring, and that they hold even more power than the laws of science because they provide us with the explanation of how laws are taking place. The question is, in light of this controversy, how that can shut down so many amazing teachable moments, how do we bridge these gaps? You know, how do we bridge the gaps in our classrooms and open a discourse in order to teach our students about evolution and have positive impact on acceptance and science literacy? How do we build that step for a better future for our country?
And now, in terms of the types of challenges that we hope to address today, what are the objectives you'd like to share for viewers that are watching this live, and also, each of you? What do you think the main concerns are that teachers have right now in teaching evolution, and how we can address those in this discussion today?
The number one objective is we want to empower teachers to be able to teach evolution. Teachers are not in isolation, but a lot of times we feel like we are. When you're in a school setting, you may be the only science teacher, you may be the only biology teacher, or there may only be a few of you, but there are thousands of us in every state. There are millions of us across the country who teach science, so why not work together and build this network to empower one another to teach and to be resources for each other? So not only to empower each other to teach evolution and controversial topics, but support each other with our personal experiences, to share resources, and to share and leave today specifically with resources and strategies to address challenges not only with our students, but sometimes from administration or from community, and to use our experiences from various parts around the country to come together and start building this network.
And Darren, what sort of resources have you found so far in terms of supporting other teachers in your own community, and also in terms of supporting yourself in response to resistance to evolution? I mean, have you encountered that yourself? And if you have, what kind of tools have you used to do so?
I have. So I've worked in a variety of schools. I've worked in urban schools here in Southern California. I worked in a more mountain community here in Northern California. And then right now I'm working in a city of about 100,000 people, but it's pretty rural around the area. It's a lot of farms, rice farms, and almond orchards and things. And so I've taught a variety of kids and around into a variety of levels of resistance. I find that connecting with teachers is really important. Connecting with teachers online from other parts of the country, especially where resistance may be a little bit lighter, maybe a little bit less, and getting comfortable with understanding that it's important to deal with that resistance and important to work on it in your own school. But yeah, connecting with people online, I use Twitter and Google Plus a lot. And I think that's important. It gets, especially for a rural community like mine, it's important to connect to the outside world. And it's a lot easier to grab onto resources that way. There's a lot of great websites out there, of course. But really using Twitter and getting people in my local school and local community also online and connected to the outside world, because sometimes we can be a little bit insulated here in the Valley in Northern California. So it's important to connect outward.
Absolutely. And I don't know, John, in terms of your experiences, if you could tell us a little bit about where you teach and also what sort of resistance you've experienced, first steps you've taken to address that would be great.
Okay, I teach in northern Indiana. We're kind of a little small town, kind of lower middle class, but still decently middle class. And we've got a large population of very devout Catholics in our area. So we have some issues that pop up when we start introducing the topic. But one thing that I found seems to help out a lot is kind of like Darren saying on Twitter and getting recent articles, recent findings, keeping it current as opposed to this is what happened 150 years ago, kind of just keeping it current and bringing it in. Well, this was just found out last week, or this is something coming in. It kind of makes it a little more accessible and a little more relatable to my students, and then just being open to kind of completely go off topic, but still on topic, like off book, but still talking about the topic, the stuff that really interests them, kind of take that, and just at the beginning of the unit, I just spend a day, and what do you guys want to know about evolution? And just what questions do you have either way, and I write down a list, and I just kind of use that and bounce around as we go through things. That seems to kind of make it a little more open for everybody and a little more willing to kind of listen to what's going on.
So sort of this this idea that you kind of build off of their existing concerns and questions and maybe even the misunderstandings that they have in the classroom.
Right, yeah, and a lot of the questions end up kind of being the same from semester to semester. Did we really come from monkeys? Always comes up. But then you get some interesting ones like, well, what's next? And is it possible to evolve backwards? And kind of interesting things to kind of build on and really get their attention as we go through everything instead of just this is this and this is and it's just a theorem, all that fun stuff.
And actually that actually jives pretty closely with one of the questions we've gotten on Twitter already, which is Justin Growick wants to know what you all think or believe to be the most harmful misconception that we address. So you mentioned do we come from monkeys as being a consistent misunderstanding that you get, and I completely relate to that. That's exactly what I experienced in the classroom. But what are the ones that you feel that stand in the way, that in the most profuse way, from you really getting to grow their understanding of evolution? What is that thing that gets in the way?
Go ahead,
Darren.
All right. I think it's probably that one, to tell you the truth. I think that in my experiences, I think it's important, like John said, to use a lot of real and modern examples. I think that's really important. I also think it's important to weave evolution throughout the year. I think sometimes we get stuck on it as a unit, and so it's this big thing coming up that gets kids kind of whipped up. And the truth is, my biology class is largely an evolution class, and it's the reason for everything. It's the reason for all the things we learn about in cells and genetics, and so it's important to weave it throughout the year. So, yeah, I think that's important. I sort of lost track of the original question, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, we're looking at, so you hit on it actually before you thought about the real
topic. I think
what is that
perception? I think you can stay off of, I'm sorry, if you treat evolution as something that happens to everything, and but as soon as you hit human evolution, I think that's when all of a sudden things are trouble. But at other times, it seems like kids handle things pretty well. So I think that probably is the one.
Personally, for me, I think the biggest thing is that my students think that evolution happens on an individual basis as opposed to a population, and that once we can kind of get out of that thinking and get the whole individuals don't evolve, but as a group, the population will, that they kind of start to see the wheels kind of and the pieces falling together, that, all right, so I'm not going to grow wings, but I can see that this over time could eventually turn into it, and that kind of picks up the pieces from over here and over there and kind of answers a bunch of other questions that, as long as it's not in one's lifetime, these big drastic changes, they're a little more willing to kind of go with us on the big changes if it just happens over this giant period of time.
And there are so many from the nature of science, how science works. We talk about just a theory, and that's something that they hang up on so much, and so much of rejection of evolution ties back to misapplications of how scientific knowledge comes about. They think a theory is an educated guess, and that theories are elevated into laws. So they say, well, I'll believe evolution when it's elevated, when it becomes a law. And I said, well, that's not really how that works. Or, well, it's not proven, so I don't believe it. And I said, well, nothing in science is proven. Proof is a function of math. It's not a function of science. So even before you even get to all the, issues of use and disuse and individual versus population, there are so many misconceptions that they get hung up on before you even get to that point. So that's such a loaded question. There are so many. But if I don't know, in my class I always start with nature of science very, very heavily, and kind of like what Darren was saying, evolution is something in my class that we do starting with day one. I mean, it is interwoven throughout, and then really when we get to the unit, they don't even realize it's a unit because it's something that we've talked about throughout the year. So it's not anything that's shocking or really even new.
And do you think that So in terms of managing those kind of, everybody brings, maybe some students actually bring the combat to class ready. They're ready for that unit. They've been prepared by their parents maybe to walk out, as you mentioned, that as a thing that could happen. And actually one of our questions describes a teacher who 33% of her class is deeply religious. They may already be prepared in the discussion and already be prepared in the argument. Mm-hmm. Is there a way that you can kind of, you don't want to talk about sneaking in evolution, right? It's a concept that's essential, but how can you kind of, as you mentioned, kind of trickle that through your curriculum in a way that maybe doesn't invite the argument until they have a complete understanding of the concept?
Well, it's always there. It's one of the 7 characteristics inherent in all living things. So that's kind of a day one. When you're talking about the human body and you're talking about skeletal development, it's a comparative anatomy exercise that we do in 7th grade. Even if you're not specifically saying, okay, this is evolution, here we go, we're talking about how things are changing, we're comparing bone structures, we're talking about pendactyl limbs. There are just little elements that are here and there, so it's not ever a, we're specifically addressing this, even though we are. It's so tied in because it is a unifying theory. It is the unifying theory in biological science. And when you treat it as such, by the time you get there, it's descent with modification, and it's less of a shock and awe campaign. Oh, well, we're going to teach, we're going to be talking about evolution next week, burn it to the ground. It's less of that and more of, oh, well, we've talked about this for the last however many weeks, and we've seen how these things change, and we've talked about, the endosymbiont theory, and we know how this, this and that has happened, and it's less shocking to them, I think. And it is. It's been very helpful, as opposed to how, maybe when I first started teaching, it was a unit, and it was a lot more surprising and controversial, I think.
I would have to agree with that. I would say that when I do it, when we do our genetics and then we do our evolution, it's kind of the order we do it in our class. But when we start talking about mutations just within the genetics section, I always bring up the seeing red was just a duplication of the gene and then a slight mutation on it and a modification, and just kind of always just a little sprinkle here, a little sprinkle here. This is kind of a neat little thing that happened because of evolution, and we'll really dive into it on down the line and just kind of throw out these little bits and pieces. They get really hooked on those, and then when we get into the actual evolution unit, we really dive in and talk about this is exactly how it worked, and this is the process, and this is what it can cause, other than just, hey, that's how we see red.
Right. I think when those situations do happen, it's important to talk with the individual, not to have a confrontation with an individual in front of class. That doesn't usually end well. So even if a kid wants to leave and go sit out in the hallway, sometimes it's just, you just need to let that happen. Talk to them afterwards. I always remember that it's not their fault. It's not their fault, and I want to deal with that individual and talk to them and talk about the fact that you're not there to be a direct conflict with what they learn and believe and value at home. I think it's really important to be honest with kids and to get their opinions. And I survey them at the beginning, so I kind of know what I'm dealing with as far as their misconceptions about evolution. I think it's really important, and I let the class see the results of that survey as well, so they can see what other people are thinking, because a lot of times it's important to just get that information out there so we can all just start from a level of understanding that we can all sort of latch onto and build from.
One thing I've started doing in my class, when I talk about the nature of science, I actually talk about science and religion, and I talk about it from a point of view of what science is as opposed to the conflict between science and religion, and that science is a physical explanation of the physical world, that science does not exist to prove or disprove the existence of a religious entity, because it doesn't. Science cannot test for the presence or absence of any religion or any God, whatever someone chooses to believe, whether it's Islam or Christianity or whatever else, because that is the realm of the supernatural, and that's not what science does. And, I feel that with my students, laying that out has allowed them to look at it from that perspective that I talk about some in the video, that you don't have to be a card-carrying atheist to be a scientist. And it's funny, I spoke with Darren's class one day, and one of the students actually asked me, are any scientists religious? And I was like, really? Of course there are a lot of scientists who are religious, and there are some, there are a lot of scientists who aren't religious and who practice it. I mean, that's a personal choice. That's not a thing where you have to be this or you have to be that. Your beliefs are your beliefs, and whatever you choose to believe is what you choose to believe. But regardless of what you choose to believe, you still need to understand the science. And I try to impress that upon my students, that regardless of your choice of religious beliefs or non-beliefs, you need to understand the science so that you can make these critical decisions when you get out in the real world. You can understand these things. You need to educate yourself regardless of what you choose to believe otherwise. And I've been amazed at how, my students have been so open to that. And, being in the southeastern United States, there is a fundamentalist Christian background. I mean, that is our community here, and that's the community I was brought up in. And so, for a lot of my students, that's something very hard. That's a big conflict. But it seems like it helps for them to understand that the two don't have to be in conflict, because, sometimes people tell them that they do, and that's not necessarily so.
Now, you mentioned this a little bit, and I think, I imagine that when you're speaking with an individual student who brings up an issue in class, the scenario that you mentioned, Darren, is having that private discussion with them outside of class. How does that discussion change when you're speaking with a parent? Parents can be especially intimidating for first-year teachers who don't have years of credibility to their aid to say, I've been doing this for years and it's sanctioned. How would you start that conversation with a parent respectfully and also constructively?
It's a lot more difficult. I've not had to do it too many times, to tell you the truth, but it is more difficult, and I just try to remind myself that my job is to teach the child. My job is not to teach the parent. A lot of times you get trapped, and this is with kids too. You get trapped with questions where they're trying to trap you, and I have to impress upon them and remind them that evolution, while it's important and universal to my class, it's a very complicated subject. It's something that there's no one single answer I can give to somebody to make them convinced that evolution is real and it's happening right now. And so I don't get into questions like that, but I do try to impress upon them that it is very important for them to understand it. It's very important for them going into the future. If your child wants to be a scientist later on, it's just important that they understand how science works and how theories work, and that's important. And it doesn't always work, and you can't always satisfy people. Luckily, in California, I have the backing of standards, and with places like Louisiana, which has had its issues recently, I don't know what you do in a state like that, but I can always say, if I have to, if I'm not getting anywhere, there's always the standards to fall back on and say that, look, this is something that we teach in the state, and it's important.
And if I could add to that, one of the things that that I would use and have used in the past, an informal education setting. So informal educators are in a weird position in that they're not obliged to teach to any set of standards, which is a very freeing thing, but in this scenario it can be a liability. A number of science organizations that have come straight out and said this should be essential in every single classroom, right? Organizations of scientists, organizations of policymakers, the National Center for Science Education does a great job pulling together, just opinion paper after opinion paper, white sheet after white sheet of organizations of huge numbers of individuals, of professionals that say, like, this has to be there, and it grossly outnumbers, the sort of creationism papers that have come out to the same effect in the opposite direction, which is saying that creationism has to be in the classroom. And I think, kind of pulling this, whether or not that's a valuable currency is kind of at the discretion of your parent. But at least having, at least saying there are all these people behind me who agree with me that this is important that your student learns, I think is a good way to start.
And also the next generation science standards. They may not be adopted in every state, but even if your state hasn't adopted them, you can fall back on the next generation science standards as a scientific body of standards that have been put together by scientists and engineers that are, at a higher level, that do include teaching evolution at a very young level as integral to scientific literacy. So, there are things that you can fall back on. There are other teachers that you can ask to join you or talk to you. You don't have to speak with a parent alone, and you certainly don't need to get into a confrontation with a parent, because that's not our purpose. Our purpose is not to convince parents, like Darren said, that there is, that they have to accept evolution or not accept evolution. Our purpose is to teach and to build science literacy. So
I agree with that. I really haven't had to experience much. I've only been teaching. I'm the young one, the inexperienced one here. I've been teaching biology for about 4 years, so I haven't encountered it much. I usually encounter it through the students, that they'll go home, they'll come to class and say, I was talking about this last night with my parents, and they said that they don't believe it, or we shouldn't be learning this in school. And it pretty much stops there. I think I've only had 2 or 3 parents actually come to me with any issues, and usually the issues I get are you going to address the other side? And all I respond with, because they've all been emails, is I just email back and say, to be honest, no, I'm not, because I'm here to teach the science, and in science there is no other side to the issue. And that usually pretty much stops it. They don't really get much of a response back, and that's kind of just all I've experienced. I haven't had anybody really come at me hard denying what I'm teaching, saying I shouldn't be teaching this. It usually just comes through the students, and I address them, and I tell my students that if your parents are upset with what's going on, tell them that you are required to learn this. I'm making you learn this stuff, and if they don't like that, or if they have an issue with it, I tell the students to tell their parents to contact me. Not to take it out on the student, that if they have any questions or they disagree with what's going on, send it my way, and I will talk to them, and that way the student can just learn what they need to learn and keep the open mind, and not have to worry about disappointing mom or dad while they're learning this.
So on kind of the flip side of that, how do you respond if they insist then that you teach the other side? You mentioned that you say, well, it's not my job to teach that. I think, and this is pushback that even we get it with our programming as well. You have all these scientific perspectives. Isn't science about objectively evaluating evidence? How come you're not evaluating scientific evidence that teaches that's a young Earth piece of evidence, for instance?
I have dealt with that in the past, not in my present setting, but in the past. And one thing that does come up with that is, of course, it is not a scientific perspective in the realms of testable science, but if you have to, again, the National Center for Science Education is an excellent resource for this. Federal law prohibits this, and a lot of times if you need to, there's case law noted on the National Center for Science Education's website that spells out what by law can and cannot be taught regarding the teaching of creationism in science classrooms and things that have been prohibited and so forth and so on. And you cannot mandate that a teacher teach creationism side by side with evolution in a science classroom. So, pull from some of those resources if you need to, because that cannot be mandated. And that's one of the things I think we're going to be seeing, come up again in the next few years with some of the issues going on in the Carolinas and in Louisiana.
I'm kind of building on that. I have had one student who kind of told me that their parents were really pushing back with her, and I offered to sit down and talk with the parents first, and just to sit and have a debate and give me your side of the story. I'm not going to teach it to the class, but I would like to sit down and talk with you as to basically what would you like if you were running the show. what would you tell them? And I've offered to sit down and talk with them and then give my side of the story. And I think that if it were ever to come up with me, I'd always kind of take it that way first. And just let's you and I sit down. We can have a discussion as two adults, and we can go from there. But I would stick to my guns and just say, and kind of like you said, even if I wanted to, I'm legally not allowed to, and just kind of use that as like the last resort and just say, my hands are tied legally.
And you guys have been using a lot of strategies that relate to your role as an educator and also your perspective on the curriculum in terms of how to address parental concerns. We had a question from Joseph Rollins, or more of a comment really, that said, having a strong background knowledge helps when talking with parents. While they may walk away disagreeing, parents appreciate it. Do you feel the need to flex your muscles in terms of your, kind of the case studies that you hold in your head that are in support of evolution in terms of the many different scales in which we see evolution? Is there a place for that? Is that the time for that?
I think that strong content knowledge is one of the greatest things that we can use in situations like this. But I also think it's one of the biggest challenges we face with our students is that people who are really strong in evolutionary biology often don't become teachers, and that's an issue because some of the questions that kids and parents give teachers are hard to deal with, are scary, are frightening for new teachers when they don't have strong content knowledge to back that up. We also talk about the situation in terms of secondary education, high school and middle school. But it's something that we really have to talk about in primary education as well. There's even fewer people who have strong content knowledge there, and a lot of these concepts are just basics about adaptation and the basics of natural selection start there, and a lot of times they're trouble spots, they're avoided, and so they become problems later on, and we see that as pushback from parents and pushback from kids, but it really started a long time ago, and that makes it difficult to deal with.
And I think in dealing with parents, when parents come to talk to me, it's very rarely because they have a question and they want to know about what's going on with evolution. It's usually because they have an issue with what's being taught. So as far as flexing your muscles and trying to push back in terms of, well, this is what evolution is and I want you to understand it, for me, I would love it if everybody accepted and understood, and it would make life a lot easier. My research would suffer tremendously, but it would make life a lot easier. But at the same time, approaching things in that confrontational manner is really not going to help the situation to improve. So I would rather start a dialogue with them about, okay, what is this issue, and encourage them to ask questions and then open the floor to talk about things rather than just flex that muscle and, okay, here's the science, here's this, and shut down that conversation. Does that make more sense? Because encouraging the conversation, to me, leads to more conversation and more questions, and them being comfortable asking questions of me and maybe encouraging their son or daughter to come to me and talk about something, as opposed to, oh, well, that person's just, virulent in their ideology, so let's just avoid it altogether, and it shuts off the conversation.
I would have to agree with what Amanda says, that just being open and willing to talk usually is the best pathway, at least for me, and just saving all that information and flexing the muscle for later. And I feel if you just sit and talk and just back and forth and, like you said, keep the dialogue open, then it really doesn't become an issue where you have to flex the muscle, because they start to see where you're coming from and see that you're not this evil person trying to push your beliefs on their child. And by doing that, they're more willing to kind of step back and, you do your thing, I'm going to do my thing, and just kind of let it go.
If you're just joining us now, this is a live discussion with our panelist educators from across the country talking about ways of negotiating challenges to teaching evolution in the classroom. So we're taking questions from Twitter. If you'd like to tweet your questions or even your suggestions and resources with the hashtag #TeachTheE, we will be ready and including them in our discussion. There's actually a really great comment here that I'd like you guys to kind of address, which is from @Paleophile, one of our resource providers, actually. Dr. S wanted to know, or made the point that the last thing we need to do is contribute to a teenager's confusion about where they came from, right? So you're talking about having these discussions and being sensitive. How do you know if you've misstepped? What's the worst case scenario here in terms of doing, in terms of still promoting your views but having a negative outcome on a student that you interact with, and how can you avoid that? Big question, but it's something I'm sure you're all thinking about.
Well, that's where that two-way dialogue comes into play. There has to be a rapport and trust for your students to interact with you and talk to you on that level. And, a lot of this is teaching 101. I mean, you monitor and guide your students, and you have to know the people that you're working with. You have to know your audience. And a lot of that has to do with knowing their background, knowing what like Darren was saying, knowing about them, knowing where they're coming from, knowing what their beliefs are and where they are in their learning path, and being able to ask them, okay, what are your thoughts on this? Where are we? And continually assessing, well, what are they saying? What are they putting on paper? You can't just stand there and say, okay, this is the evidence for evolution. Evolution is real. All right, moving on. This is a two-way ongoing measurement of what am I hearing them talking about when I'm moving around. I mean, it is a very dynamic process. You have to listen and really pay attention, and knowing those misconceptions going in the door and addressing them continually, because sometimes they go from one set of misconceptions to another set of misconceptions, and it's like, no. Let's do this again. And again, a lot of that's not just evolution, that's just good teaching. Continuous evaluation and just being on point with what you're doing. Making sure that they're internalizing and building on good information.
I try to make sure with my students that they know that what I'm telling them, what I'm teaching them, isn't my personal opinion. I stress that at the very beginning, that this is not my belief. I will never tell you what my personal belief is. Mm-hmm. I'm going to teach you the science. If you want to know my opinion, my personal opinion, I tell them I will talk with them outside of class, either before school, after school, but I will never stand in front of the class and tell you my personal beliefs on anything, because I don't want them to think that this is my opinion. I want them to know that what I'm teaching them is the scientific background, the science behind everything, and that it's not my personal agenda. And by doing that, I typically have 2 or 3 kids a year who want to know my viewpoint on like the evolution versus religion debate, and I'll talk to them about it, but if they ask me in the middle of class, I tell them I will not answer that. I'll tell you after class if you want. Stay after. We can chat then. So just to make sure that they know that what is going on is science and not belief.
Yep. I completely agree with both of them, and what John just said is really important. I watch myself all year long. I think it starts from the beginning. Like Amanda said, it starts with knowing your kids really well, but then also watching the way you talk about science and the nature of science is really important, and that you're not using the words, you're watching how you use the words, even like believe, because it's really important that you use those terms judiciously and correctly. So I could not agree more with both of them.
And I was just thinking today, speaking of using your words carefully, that in reading up and just reading and kind of keeping track of everything in anticipation of today, just the word, I see a lot that, do you believe in evolution? Or there's this problem about believing in evolution. And I never thought of it until today, but that just sends the wrong message, using the word belief. And I know I have the tendency to sometimes throw, you don't have to, like, believe, and for some reason the light bulb clicked in me today that I wouldn't say I don't believe in math, or do you believe in geometry? Then why am I using the word believe with evolution? I wouldn't use it for anything else. So I think, at least personally, that watching stuff like that is something that might lead some astray that, well, if I say the word believe, then it makes it a belief and not science, and I wouldn't use it with any other topic, so just being careful with the word choice is super important.
It's hard, but unfortunately, even science videos do it. They'll say that a precursor to whales is believed to be, and sometimes I have to explain that. Sometimes we have to talk about when they say believe in this context, it's because they have evidence A, B, B, C to support that argument. So it's difficult, but it's constantly watching the way you talk about science and the nature of science. It's really important.
And I always make a distinction between knowledge, understanding, acceptance, and belief. And I drive students crazy with this because there is a difference between the four. And, with mine I say, acceptance, when it comes to evolution, it's a function of acceptance and rejection. You don't believe in evolution. It doesn't matter if you believe in evolution because evolution is going to occur whether you believe in it or not.
You're a participant no matter what.
Exactly. Beliefs are a function of your faith. Beliefs are a function of, what you believe in is a function of extra rational consideration of your experiences and your ideas, whereas acceptance is based on a logical consideration of the physical evidence in front of you. So, that's something we distinguish between, and I know I drive them crazy a lot of, that's one of many things, I'm sure, that I drive them crazy with, but, that's something very important for them to understand, that, one does not simply believe. In evolution, you don't have to believe in it, it's going to occur.
So I know that we're running into the hour here, and I'm curious, we've had a few questions about teacher prep, so how we train teachers so that they can kind of negotiate these things appropriately the first time, right? So how they're maneuvering through their own communities. What can we add to teacher professional development to get our teachers ready to teach evolution? And maybe more, what do we need to change about it even to make it more effective?
I think it actually needs to go even back to teacher education programs. Thinking back to my own teacher education program, we did a lot of skills on how to teach labs effectively and how to present content effectively, but I don't recall a whole lot about how to deal with so-called controversy. And so I think it actually needs to start at the graduate program level with teacher education programs and making sure we're preparing teachers for the kinds of things they could experience when they get into the classroom. So I really think it even starts there, even before teacher PD at your own sites.
Yes. One thing that I think content-wise that would be beneficial is nature of science classes. One thing that would help a lot of, I think, pre-service science teachers is understanding how science actually works. We assume that because people have a lot of science classes that they know how scientific knowledge is generated, but in reality, that's just not the case. And between that and having those practical experiences, especially with parents and students and things like that, it would be extremely helpful.
I think that just having more hands-on experience. I went through a transition to teaching program, so I had gotten my bachelor's degree in biology first, and then had a year-long program. And I know that we had much more student teaching than some of my friends who had went through a traditional teaching program. We student taught for basically the entire year, August to December, and then January through the 1st of May. And I feel like that prepared me far more than my classes, because some of my classes were just like, in an ideal situation, this is what it is. And then you get into the classroom, and it's definitely not this perfect situation. So I just think being presented with actual more opportunities to have discussions about different topics, and just more of this, basically it all goes back to keeping the dialogue open. Mm-hmm. Just that teachers or pre-service teachers need to be aware of these are the issues, and have a way to just be able to talk with people who have both gone through it and offer suggestions, and then, like, without actually going through it themselves, almost just like mock, like, simulations, basically almost like student teaching but for parent interactions. That's where I feel like I lacked the most preparation was with. I felt comfortable dealing with students, but then when it came to parents, the very first parent email I got, I was like, oh my god, I don't know how do I respond to this? I don't want to be too put. So I think just more preparation with talking to non-students is because it's all, of course, all focused on the students, but that you're only a portion of their lives. You've got these other people who are influencing them, and just being young, I don't have any kids, and none of my friends had kids, so I wasn't really friends with parents other than my friends' parents, and that's a whole different situation. And now as I get older, I'm starting to see that there's other sides of things that when I first came out of college, I never thought of. So it's just kind of something as... Now I'm just rambling, so I'm just going to kind of stop because I'm losing my train of thought. But
I think... Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying one great thing with that, though, that reminds me of something you said earlier, Darren, is mentoring. And, we think, okay, some schools have mentor programs, but, you can find your own mentor, and Twitter is a great place to do things like that, or Google Hangouts. You don't have to wait for a school to find you a mentor and hope that works out. Go online and find somebody that you click with. And if you're struggling with a content area, find somebody in that content area. There are scientists out there that would love to talk to your classroom. There are science educators out there that would love to answer your questions. And so you can get out there and make these connections and really empower yourself, and we can empower each other to teach any topic, whether it's evolution or anything else, just by saying, hey, is anybody out there doing this? My students are interested in this. You can take your students out to universities to present research or to do original research. There's anything out there that you can do, and there's all these amazing tools out there if you're just willing to look for it. So.
And the reason I'm here is I connected with Dr. Glaze at one point and had her talk to my class. I just sent her a message on Twitter and said, hey, I've been following you for a while, and I would love to have you talk to my class. And she was more than ready and eager to do it. And that makes a big difference with your kids, too, when they hear that it's not just you in front of the class that's telling me this and something that only you believe is happening. When you pull in people from all parts of the world, and you can do that via Twitter and via Google Hangouts and Google+. That is super powerful. And then I think once you get to a site like good vertical alignment is really important. I'm at a K-8. It's important to have those discussions about, as the 8th grade teacher and the 7th grade teacher, what do I want? What do I want kids to be coming in with as far as prerequisite knowledge? Because just because the standards are there doesn't mean that the kids are going to come to me with the knowledge that I expect they're going to have. So it's important to have those conversations all the way down from grade 12 all the way down to kindergarten and have frequent meetings. Nobody wants extra meetings, but sometimes you have to do it.
Yeah, and I would have to, I guess, third the whole making your professional network extend beyond your school, because I know when the Ebola thing first happened, my students were freaking out, as was a lot of people among the country, and just spur of the moment, 15 minutes before school started, I just threw something out on Twitter and decided that I was going to take that day to teach my students about it, and just said, is there anybody out there studying diseases or whatever who would be able to answer some of my students' questions? And within no time, I had a couple responses back, and we just did a Q&A with an epidemiologist, and my students thought it was the craziest thing. And to this day, I still have students that they were going around telling that they were educating their family, their church, their friends all about Ebola just from that one day. So being able to reach out and just, so that's super awesome of you, Amanda, that you did that.
Yeah.
Anytime, I love it.
Middle school kids are not good at thanking you all the time. I got multiple kids that came up to me and thanked me for getting Amanda to talk to them. They'll remember that for a long time. It's super important, and I think people need to.
Yeah, I think in terms of viewing, also the internet is this dynamic community, right? Everybody's turning on new stuff all the time, and we're kind of ending on the hour here, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to hear your favorite resources. In addition to the human resources that you guys have all mentioned, right? Getting out and building your professional learning network. What's your one go-to? What is your if you had, for instance, we had a couple parents who are homeschool educators who are having a hard time not finding faith-based evolution curricula for their homeschoolers. We have teachers that maybe aren't as well connected. For me, it was CK12 because they produce open textbooks, so you can get a NGSS aligned biology top to bottom resources list.
Everything CK12 for every dictionary, yes, and workbooks.
Yeah. Well, no, and I know we posted, Amanda, we posted your resource list on our website at sciencefriday.com/evolution. You can see it there. You know, and we'll also email it out to our Educate listserv. So if you'd like to enroll in our Educate listserv as an audience member, you can do that at scifry.me/edu newsletter and enroll in that, and we'll be sending that out along with the summary of this discussion. So John, Darren, Amanda, as your last farewell, would you please share with everyone your favorite go-to resource for preparing for your evolution discussions?
I'll start. I'm actually looking forward to seeing one that I saw come across Twitter today that Nova PBS released an Evolution Lab website. I'd like to see that. There's one at Berkeley, ucmp.berkeley.edu, I believe. Has a lot of great resources and actually has a lot of information about talking with parents and students too about issues you might be having, and some great activities. So I'll go with those couple, but there's lots.
I would have to agree. There's a whole bunch. Probably the one I referenced a lot more than the others it's Dr. Neil Shubin's book, and then it was turned into a PBS special, Your Inner Fish. Because we're about an hour out from Chicago, so when I say he works at University of Chicago, they're like, oh, he's like right down the street practically. And read the book. I offer the book to any student who wants to read it because it's a great read and does a really good job explaining everything. And then there's the PBS special, and I think it was 3 parts, and there's a whole bunch of resources on their website about it. And when I just say, oh yeah, it came from a fish, just kind of in passing real fast, they're still like, wait, what? And kind of catches their attention. So that's probably my biggest go-to, just to pull a piece. And then other places, just bits and pieces from there. But there are so many out there.
Absolutely.
Well, there are lots of great ones, and you can download my file. Shout out to Paleophile, who's put together an incredible resource on her blog, which is on my list. Her whole blog is on my list because it's incredible. A great book for preschool-aged kids is called Grandmother Fish. You have to check it out. It is absolutely gorgeous artwork, and the book is incredible as well. The NC website from Indiana has some great ready-to-go lesson plans and everything for teaching evolution and the nature of science. I'm trying to run through. There are so many out there that are really, really good. And one of my favorite places to go and resources is the Human Origins program at the Smithsonian Institute. So I will stop at that because I could ramble on for days and days and days and days. So that's why I put together a list.
That's perfect. I think what we're going to do is compile all of the resources that you guys have brought up in this discussion. We're also going to prove you all, get an email list going of all of your favorite resources, so we're going to have a whole mess of them on our site in addition to this discussion. Please feel free to share this discussion with your colleagues if you're watching at home or at school right now, because we're going to have it all online in addition to some multimedia resources and the resources shared by our guest. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, audience members, for joining us today. Any lasting questions or thoughts, please tweet them with the hashtag #TeachTheE. And it's been a lovely discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
It's been great.